Good morning. I think we're ready to get started. I don't know if the microphone's working, but can everyone hear me?
Yep.
Okay. My name's John Shortis. This is Interactive Maps in a Snap. I'll be talking about making maps with the Snap.svg JavaScript library. First, let me just tell you a little bit about my background. I just celebrated the 20th anniversary of making my very first website last week. And I've been doing it pretty much full-time ever since. Started out kind of as a geek of all trades webmaster type, and then focused on content development for a while and project management. And a few years ago, took a couple-year detour into federal contracting. I was working for a contractor supporting the Department of Energy. And that's where I first got into Drupal, maybe 6 years ago. That was the very early days of the energy.gov project. And that's where I rediscovered PHP. So I kind of dusted off some 10, 15-year-old PHP coding chops and discovered that I really enjoyed Drupal. And I'm now Director of Technology for Foresight Studios. We are a digital creative agency in Columbia Heights. On the web side of the company, we do most of our work in Drupal and mostly for nonprofits in the DC area. We are not really what you'd call a big data analytics company. We do some medium data. So this is a project we did for the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation a few years ago, and it maps about 319,000 supporters and 3,800 leaders who are working to fight the childhood obesity epidemic. And we did a map for the Slate Group and Amtrak a couple of years ago for Black History Month. And for projects like that, we really like tools like MapBox.js. But that's medium data. We do some of that, not a whole lot. We do a whole lot of what I call little data. And by little data, I mean something like this. So this is what I call a state-by-state scorecard. So we've got a national map where each state is shaded according to some data point. And you might have a couple more data points in the sidebar, and that changes with the selected state. Or maybe you've got a couple of different data points where you are changing the shading. So you're looking at a couple of different things. And for something like that, MapBox or OpenLayers is just overkill. So back in the And what this is displaying, it's displaying college completion rates for Latino students in different states and territories across the US. In the bad old days, we'd have done a project like this in Flash. Maybe we would have done a client-side image map with a whole lot of custom JavaScript. We started doing them as SVGs with a lot of custom JavaScript. There were some libraries at the time for generating SVGs, most notably a library called Raphael. It didn't really work for this. It lets you create SVGs on the fly. It doesn't really let you manipulate existing SVGs. Is everyone familiar with SVGs and what they are and what they can do? I can give you a 30-second, way oversimplified explanation. So SVGs are scalable vector graphics. And by vector, that means that they are line or path-based. They're not dot or pixel-based. And what you can do is you can describe paths and shapes on an XY coordinate system. So you can say, go to X coordinate 20 and Y coordinate 50 and make me a circle of radius 10. That XY coordinate system is scalable, so it's not pixels, it's just units, and you can scale that to fit your display. So you can create a graphic and use that same graphic file for an iPhone or a Jumbotron screen, and you're not going to get jaggies. It is not a binary file format, it's an XML format. And if you really, really wanted to, you can actually create an SVG file in a text editor. I wouldn't recommend it. I have edited SVG files in text editors, but it's a little gnarly. So we had SVGs. We couldn't really manipulate them with Raphael. But then a year and a half or so ago, a new library came out called Snap.svg. Started at Adobe, and it's written from scratch by the original author of Raphael. It's available under an Apache 2.0 license, and it's basically the successor to Raphael. It's built for modern browsers. One of the big problems with Raphael is it had to support a bunch of old browsers that no one likes to support anymore. So Snap.svg works in IE9 and up, and modern versions of just about every other browser. And because it got rid of a lot of the old cruft, it's a lot more capable. It has a lot of features that you couldn't do before. Masking, clipping, patterns, gradients, groups, animation, a whole lot more. And it also lets you work with existing SVGs. So you can create an SVG on the fly, but you can also load in an SVG and manipulate it. And I'm going to show you a little bit about how that works in just a minute. So what it lets you do is it lets you select individual elements inside your SVG file and manipulate them, similar to how jQuery works on objects in the DOM. So this is a very simple hello world. And the first thing we're doing is loading in the Snap library. And I had a laser pointer. Let's see if I can find it. So we load in the Snap library. Then the first thing we do is we create an empty SVG. And that's where we're going to be working. Then that has an ID that we can target. Then we create a new Snap canvas we're calling S, and we're targeting that ID. Then we use the text method to put this piece of text at coordinates 200 and 120. And then we set the attributes for that text. We set the fill, the font size, and the font weight. And we get something like that. So it's pretty easy. And here, I'm just added to the bottom of that a new polygon, which, so this should be S. I changed it just to be shorter. This is a rectangle method, and it's saying at 100, 200, give me a rectangle of width 500 and height 300. This is a shortcut. You can also do a polygon or polyline method, and that's basically just give the XY coordinates of every vertex in the shape. And that will give you something like that. Okay, so now we've got Kansas, only 49 more states to go. But not really, because that's about half of the polygons for Alaska. We really, really don't want to be drawing maps on the fly every time. So fortunately with Snap, we can just load in an existing SVG. And this is how you do that. So there's a load method. And we just give it the file name. And then there's a callback function that tells Snap what we want to do with the file once we've loaded it. So what I'm doing here is I know that this SVG has a group wrapped around everything called G. So I'm selecting G, and this is what Snap.svg calls a fragment. So that's the fragment that I'm going to be working with. I'm calling it map. And then I'm appending map to my canvas, S. And now, the elements within that group. One of the nice things about SVGs is they can have classes and IDs, and you can target them with CSS. So I know in this map that all of the states and territories have IDs that match their postal code abbreviations. So I can just say, VA equals map select with the ID of VA, and now I can fill it and make Virginia blue. And I'm also going to add a click handler. And if we were to do that, we would get something like this. So we get a blue Virginia and a pop-up. And remember, you can also just change a color or change any attribute in CSS. The syntax is a little bit different. So instead of color or background color, it's fill and stroke. But you can do some shortcuts there if you don't want to go and recolor your black base map to match your site. You can just do that in CSS rather than having to do it in JavaScript. Now, rather than manually create fragments for all of our states, we can do it dynamically. So let's pretend that this is an array with some sort of data about all of our states and territories. And it's keyed by the postal code. And remember, the postal code is also the ID for the state in the SVG. In a real project, we'd probably be pulling this from a JSON file. But just pretend that there's a big array here. So we create our canvas. We create a new group. We create a new array for our state fragments. We load our map. And then our callback function, we just iterate through this state data array. And we go to each index. We select the SVG element that matches that ID. And then we append all of that to our canvas. So now we have an array with keys that match all of the elements within our SVG. So now that they're in the canvas, we can iterate through that array. We can load some sort of other data that was in this file, and that's going to go into this data variable. And now we can use that to set some attribute. So here I'm setting the opacity. So we've got a completely blue map. We're pulling in some sort of data field, and we're using that to set the opacity. So we would get something like that. And that's basically how we create these quick and dirty maps. In a real project, there would be a bit more code. You know, we would handle other data points. We would put some sort of text in an info box on the side. We would have a legend. We would change which data point is adjusting the opacity. We'd handle mouse overs. That's all really basic jQuery. Since most of our projects are Drupal, we started Drupalifying this process a little bit. So created a small custom module that generates the block, attaches the CSS, attaches the JavaScript. And you know, we can create one of these in an hour or two. You just drop in a JSON file with the data. You adjust some variable names in the JavaScript to match the field names in the JSON. You tweak a little bit of CSS. You change some text in the template file to customize your labels in your info box in the sidebar. Occasionally we'd have to swap out the base map because sometimes we needed territory, sometimes we didn't. So about a month ago, I decided to Drupalify this the rest of the way. Basically get all of the content and config out of the code into the database where it belongs. And the result is something called SnapMap. And it is a sandbox project now. And if there's interest, I will promote this to a full project. It's still in the early stages, but the basics work. And let's see if I can get the demo to work here. So this is running locally. This is just a block. And all of this config right now is just in the variables table, but I've tried to, make this as generic as possible. So you can put in the SVG file, put in the JSON file, put in your field labels, set which of those fields controls your opacity, put in some information for your legend, and that will give you this. And we can go in and change these. And I don't remember what data is in what field, but this should look different. So now that's a little bit different. There are some things here that I definitely want to fix. Just if this is moving beyond just our use. So I've got a little bit of a roadmap, but the next thing I'm probably going to do is make this an entity. Right now, this is all in the variables table, so a site only supports one map, but it's going to be pretty easy to convert this to a custom entity, put all of the map data into an entity, and then you can have as many maps on a site as you want. A big limitation is right now your JSON file has to have field 1, field 2, field 3, field 4, field 5. Editing JSON files is kind of a pain, even if you do search and replace. So that's a pretty easy fix. So that'll be one of my next commits. There are lots of other things that I can do. I think one of the things I'm looking for is what are things that people would be interested in. So I'm definitely interested in people kicking the tires here and getting feedback, but also learning about other people's adventures using Snap.svg for maps or for other things, and how we can do maps that are, I don't want to say quick and dirty, but streamlined and efficient. So that is it. That was a little shorter than I expected, but I can do some Q&A, I can do some more demo, and I see some hands, so I guess in the back to begin.
How does it work with responsive?
It is pretty much responsive out of the box. So if you shrink your viewport, let's see if I can get this to work. I may, okay, that one is not. And that's just,
That's not a responsive theme.
it is not a responsive theme. That's part of it. So if I had the block in a different theme, I believe it would shrink down. On the client side, it was responsive and things would move down. And
Just relational to the box, basically.
right. And when you declare your SVG tag, there are elements that you can put in that tag that tell it how to preserve the aspect ratio as the display port changes. Some of that is in the module now, some of it's not. So I've got a lot of that just in custom code, but it's moving into the module as that module gets more capability. Yes?
Is there a way to have geocodes to put a flag on a particular geocode point?
For that, I would use a different mapping technology. I'd use something like MapBox.js or OpenLayers if you're having to deal with explicit latitude, longitude points. For this, it's something where you're dealing with political subdivisions. So here it's states within the US. It could be counties within a state. It could be wards within the District of Columbia. But if you want to do both, you could potentially put a layer on top of this. It would be a little bit messy, but it could work. But I think if you were going to do that, you might just want to create a base map with your political subdivisions in it already. Yes?
Where's a good source to get the data files?
So your data files, I mean, for our data files come from the client.
I mean the vector.
Oh, the vector graphics. I believe I pulled this one off Wikipedia, actually. So if you just search for SVG maps, they're all pretty standardized. And there was one map that I used for one project where I had to hack it a little bit. We had to put in Puerto Rico and had to then scale it so it sort of matched the scale of the rest of the maps.
How does this compare with Leaflet?
So Leaflet, I don't use Leaflet all that much. I use MapBox.js, which is built on top of Leaflet, and it's a lot more capable, but it lets you add layers and geocode-specific points on top of that. This is more just for quick infographics. And yeah, the goal is to be able to create something like this in 15 minutes.
Right.
Yes.
So have you ever come across maybe converting shapefiles into an SVG? How big is, you say, that map of the United States? I mean, I'm used to working with OpenStreetMap, which is like terabytes
Right.
of data. And I'm thinking this is kind of cool for that base map. Everybody has a map of the world that they use.
Right.
It's all humongous.
Yeah, and it depends on how detailed you need to get. You know, SVGs are resolution independent, but you know, how much detail do you need on the coastline of California? So if you're displaying this on a mobile device, you don't need very much. If you're displaying it on a Jumbotron, you need a little more. So you can certainly convert from a shapefile, but it really depends on how much resolution you need. And for something like this, where it's a dashboard or a scorecard, you don't need a whole lot. You just need to recognize the state.
So you're not zooming and panning with these?
No, not for these. You potentially could, but you know, for the use case that we have here, that's more capability than we need. So we don't use a tool that really requires doing all of that. Yeah, we've got a library of vector maps of the U.S. You know, with or without territories, and we've done a couple where it's counties within a state, and you know, those are easily obtainable or easily creatable. You can just create it in Illustrator and export it. Yes.
Are there maps for industrial districts?
Yes, and you can, if you have a tool to create those, it's likely that tool can export them as SVGs, but I have seen congressional district maps as SVGs before, and you just need to know what the naming convention is, so you know that if you're targeting the 9th district in California, you know what ID you need to target. Yes?
Does anything happen when you mouse over this right now? For example, if you mouse over the state of Virginia, could you, okay.
Yes. So what it's doing is I've got a JSON file and it's got 4 fields of data, and it's just random data for this demo, but it's changing the info box here.
If there was a way to see the specific data points.
And it's not in the module yet, but we've done some custom work where there are buttons or tabs where you can change the opacity. You can change the base map. So the map would change, but the field controlling the opacity would change. And that's just simple JavaScript, and it's just changing the data that is applied to the SVG. Yes?
Can you group some states? Because US government is using region, like San Francisco region, Boston region.
Yes. So in your SVG, you can just wrap a G element around it and then target that as one. Or you can, when you're building your fragment, you can select multiple items for your fragment. So if you're doing, I was going to suggest time zones, but time zones don't necessarily correspond with state boundaries. But if you're targeting regions, like the Southeast region or the Mid-Atlantic region, when you select those states, you can then create a group and then target them as a group. So that's very easy. It's, 3 lines of code maybe. It's selecting all of your states and then wrapping a group around it. Yes?
Have you tested it all for accessibility?
Yes, it's pretty accessible, and you can have arbitrary properties or elements within each element of your SVG. So you can have title fields. Now, mousing over for a visually impaired user is fairly challenging. We do not recommend using maps for navigation for that purpose. For info display, we try to provide a text equivalent. So you've got the sidebar here. That sidebar is controlled by a mouse over. If you need it to be 100% accessible, you would probably want a different way to select the state as well. So a select element or a text field or something. But that's not baked into the module yet. We have worked on that with custom work. But yeah, the module right now is kind of a proof of concept. So all of those things are going to get back into it as we build it out. Yes?
I just wanted to ask about the original data.
Mm-hmm.
So in that array, what you said when you were showing the demo,
Right.
that was a JSON file, you said. And that has all of the coordinates that make the map, and it has all of the data in it too, or those are separate files?
No. So this is the JSON file, and it's just state names. And then I think PHP Storm will load an SVG. Let's find out. Yes, it will. So this is what an SVG looks like, and it's an XML file. And it has some basic JavaScript. But if you look, there's an ID and a title for each state and territory. So, this is the map. This is the data. And what correlates the two is the postal code abbreviation. So as long as you know what your base map has, you can create a data file that matches it pretty easily. And if it's something weird where you're dealing with some other state abbreviation or some other ID, you can either adjust your JSON file, you can adjust your base map. It would probably be easier to adjust your JSON file because your SVG files get a little long. Yes?
Do fields 1 through 5 need to be numerical right now, or can you put text?
They can be text. It will just display what's there. And I think my next update is just going to be adding fields within the configuration that says field 1 is this field name in the JSON file, field 2 is this field name in the JSON file, just so you don't have to change your JSON file to match the module, to let the module deal with whatever it gets. So that will make it a lot easier to use, and that's a pretty easy fix. It's just something I haven't gotten to yet. Yes?
So on my project, I support IE8.
Uh-huh.
What would you recommend?
If you need to support IE8, I would maybe recommend, you can do something similar to this just through CSS and some custom JavaScript. So just in your CSS, you manually set the opacity for every state, and then you do whatever sort of whiz-bang effects in JavaScript or jQuery or whatever limited version of JavaScript or jQuery IE8 lets you use. But Snap.svg explicitly does not support anything before IE9. And that's one of the good things and one of the bad things about it, because they explicitly do not support older browsers. It lets them do a lot of really cool stuff with the newer browsers. Yes?
That's due to the fact that IE doesn't support SVG at all. So what you want to do is create a PNG fallback. And Grunt and Gulp both have functions that can do that for you. It would be a little bit complicated due to the fact that everything's being pulled in from an array. So you'd probably just want to have a fallback image and just not do any of the functionality.
Thank you. Yes?
Well, how do you make an SVG file? Like, can Illustrator?
Illustrator can export SVGs. If you're really, really patient, you can create one in a text editor. I would not recommend it. I've done it just to do it. It's a lot of typing and a lot of numbers.
Does PowerPoint export as an SVG?
I don't know. I have not dealt with PowerPoint in a long time. I would not be surprised if it did, but I know Illustrator does it. I know most of your major drawing programs and mapping programs will export SVG now. It's become a pretty widely used standard, and we use it for lots of things. So we use it for icons, we use it for logos, because they're scalable, and because it's very easy to create responsive versions because you just scale it, and you can use the same base file. So we use them all the time. Anyone else? Okay, going once, going twice. I'll be around to answer questions if anyone has them. Otherwise, thank you for coming. And actually, let me get back. I've got a couple of resources here. So I talked about the possible next steps, but if you want to learn more about Snap.svg, here are some resources, and I will be putting the slide deck and the recording up on the session page later today. And here's my contact information. If you have some questions or comments or have some ideas for the module. So thank you very much.
Thank you.